it's me, CheesyPaninie. As promised, here's a video going into a little bit more detail on how I made Viridescent Forest and what my thought process was going into it. For this build, I actually did make a sketch before I started building. I looked through Pinterest to get several ideas for the build and to figure out how to arrange the landscape. And I was really inspired by this one photograph of a pond that led to a small cave. But I also like the idea of a tree being a cave entrance, so I put the two ideas together and sketched it out. Once the rough draft was done, I went to work. TEdit was such a blessing in the first build, and I thought about using it again to help me create this build and learn a little bit more about what it can do in the process. I find it really useful for sketching out the main shape of the tree cave and the landscape of the forest. One of the things that I find really cool about TEdit is the fact that I can pull out my trusty pen tablet and use it to draw on it. It felt just like working with other drawing softwares like Sprite. For the second day, I went into the game and started putting in the details. I wasn't sure about what material to use yet, so it was really fortunate that Real Logic has made block swap a thing in the 1.4 update because I can simply place dirt blocks and change it to something else later on. It lets me just focus on the form first and think about the materials later. So while I was working on the pond and placing some grass, I had this idea of using echo blocks above the grass so that it wouldn't get covered by the water. I ended up with this interesting effect which made the water look like it just settled above the walls without any blocks covering them. So I proceeded to do the same for the surfaces of the other grassy areas. I didn't want to make the mini islands look too flat though, so I placed the blocks randomly and mixed them up with clay, mud, and ebonstone blocks, while also leaving some gaps and plants here and there. I also stumbled upon this idea that I picked up from Bob Ross, where he puts water lines where the land meets the water, and thought about doing something similar here. You can achieve this effect by placing two blocks within the water and using a sponge in between them to create this gap that also lets some light pass through, illuminating the water in the process. As for the cave entrance, I tried out different things to make it interesting, starting with a plain old emerald gemspark walls, painted teal, which I then replaced with starry walls and vortex fragments floating about. This second version could have been pretty good, except it just didn't lead your eye towards it, and the prompt did say it had to be a bright green light coming from a cave. It just didn't feel accurate to the prompt. So I went back to the first version and added some depth by putting some stalagmite details and some walls that suggest that there was a path that went upward, which seemed even brighter inside. Now if you already have gemspark walls and want to use a wall that's brighter than that, cloud walls are the way to go. It gives off the same effect as when you have a hole on your wall. So for the tree itself, I actually thought of the build concept a long time ago and I was going to include it in another video about trees, but decided against it because I was making way too many videos on trees at the time and I don't want to solely be a tree building channel. I wanted to try and see if I can make the leaves without using any of the usual items like leaf blocks or walls and used crimson scab walls instead. I also used ice elemental banners and initially planned for these to be the leaves instead and placed them on vortex fragment blocks and echo blocks. But it didn't really feel right and it still felt like it lacked something. But before we move on to the next day, here's a little bit of detail I added to the pond that I learned from one of Chaos's videos. I placed echo blocks all over the blank spots in the water and actuated them in order to let the light in and make it look a lot more radiant. This is a pretty good alternative to gemspark walls when illuminating water. I took a day off and continued the day after. I added more water lines and refined the shape of the tree. I even added some details on the trunk of the tree to make it look like a part of it was carved out or rotting. I also caved in and started using leaf blocks and a couple of blueberries to make up the rest of the leaves. From afar, the banners started looking a lot more like the tree's fruits than leaves, so I just went with that instead. I also added some vortex candelabras and web ropes as small buds and flowers because I just wanted to overload this tree with as many things as I could get away with. To make the tree have a somewhat 3D effect, I placed diamond gem sparks behind certain parts of the trunk, while some branches were either actuated or painted black to push it to the back. In the past, whenever I make forest builds, I usually make custom trees, but today I thought of experimenting with actual in-game trees. I thought it would be a nice change, and I also mistakenly thought doing so will make the work easier and faster. But boy was I wrong. After copy-pasting a few trees, I suddenly felt so powerful and got a little too excited about it that I started placing them everywhere. I spent a big chunk of the fourth day just placing those trees and working on the landscape. I began to place paths and stairs and started working on this small shrine. And this was also the day I remembered that you can place deco items with TEdit. Deco items are the items in the environment that you can't really place normally and just get generated along with the world. I actually don't get why they didn't let these items be placed or obtained like all the other items. I feel like a lot of people would benefit from having these readily available in the game because it opens up so many building possibilities. That's actually why I ended up working a lot longer on this build because I kept discovering something new and wanted to test out different things in TEdit. At some point, I discovered that you can change the grass blocks underneath trees into echo blocks and it would look as if the trees were naturally growing straight from the ground. I got so excited that I did it with all of the trees. Unfortunately, I soon came to regret it because when I got back into the game after some time, all the treetops and leaves disappeared. A couple of them managed to retain their leaves, but most are just gone. I guess that's what happens when you try to mix unnatural things together, especially if you do it through mods or TEdit. There's always a chance it would be buggy, so I had to redo the whole thing. But before I did, I took a screenshot and plotted out my plans for the landscape. It kind of helps a lot to draw on it because it makes the look of the build a lot clearer in my head than just blindly building. I made the scope of the build a lot bigger because in my mind it would be a lot easier to just cut out those parts when I make it into a wallpaper. But then I started experimenting with land formations and made this earth brownie thing, which kind of sort of looks like a truck that's buried under grass and dirt. Whichever it is, I thought it looked really interesting and I lamented the fact that it was so far from the center and would just get cut off from the wallpaper. And just because of that, I started contemplating on whether or not I should make the area even larger. Spoiler alert, I made it larger. On the fifth day, I didn't really do that much work and was slowly starting to burn out. I wanted to get at least a little bit of work done, so I placed craggy stone walls around the places that I wanted to elevate and added some more varieties of walls on the paths to make it blend a lot better with the green grass. I also managed to work on the space for the small shrine in the forest. Aside from this, I added a couple of platforms and echo blocks so there would be places for people to stand and walk on. I took another day off to replenish my brain cells and worked again the day after. I started working on the cliffs, figuring out the best way to design them, and I initially used so many different blocks and walls to make it look 3D, but it just ended up looking like a hot mess, especially once I added the plants. I mean, you can even see the detail here. I was not happy with how it looked at all. I went through multiple changes and eventually decreased the amount of materials I was using to simplify it. To sum it up, for the size of the cliffs, I had a texture that looked a bit plain, a texture that was a little rocky, another one that had big rocks, and all of these had to have a lighter and darker shade. The other walls are the ones I used for dirt and surfaces of the cliffs as well as the grassier areas. Since I used them previously on other parts of the build, I just copied them. Once I was finally happy with the cliffs, I started placing the trees, decos, grass, flowers, and all of those things, but this time, a section at a time. I didn't want to have a repeat of what happened before where I placed so many trees and had to remove them because of an error. Adding the grass, flowers, and other decos has got to be the most fun and also the most tedious and mind-numbing part of the whole build because I had to hammer or delete walls behind them each time I place a new one for that swaying effect. I mean, I could just leave some walls on, but no, I wanted them all to sway if I could help it. It just adds so much more life to the build, how could I not? You can hardly even see the hole, which is pretty nice. The only ones I really ignored were the bushes because they were too big, and in order for them to sway you had to remove big chunks of wall, and the gaps just didn't look good to me. And to kind of blend the grass block below the trees, I put some leaf and rich mahogany leaf blocks underneath. At this point in the build, I had begun telling myself that today is gonna be the day I finish this build. But it's not. I had the general idea and direction all figured out, and I just needed to finish detailing the rest of the build, and I was pretty much done. But I didn't realize it was going to take me a lot longer than I anticipated. So on the 7th day, I started things off by placing a couple more plants and decos and finishing off the design of the shrine, making sure I left offerings of a plate of golden delight, a bottle of sake, and a peach. After that, I placed a gosh darn amount of trees and plants again and finally fixed those mishmash of blocks that I had no idea what to do with before. And I have to say, clearing that part out was pretty satisfying. Now with a build of this size, one of my concerns is making it visually interesting without overloading it with the same things. I didn't want to put the same number of trees and plants for the whole space because that would look very monotonous. So I planned it out in a way to make certain areas have a whole bunch of trees, while certain areas are a little more bare but have more flowers and grass. I also used up this day to fix the land surrounding the giant tree. I realized that since this tree is supposed to lead to a cave, the land behind it should be a lot higher than it is now. But if I did that, some of the banners I placed won't sway in the wind anymore because the back of it will be covered by a wall. So I went into TEdit and lifted up the upper part by a few blocks. But because of that, I just gave myself a whole lot more work to do. On the 8th day, I was burning. I really wanted to finish the whole build by this day, but certain discoveries delayed that. I started off the day continuing where I left off with the land behind the tree, giving it a lot more depth and detail by copying the style and block combinations I did with the other cliffs. Speaking of cliffs, I finally got around to fix the form of the cliffs at the lower left side. They were looking a little too rounded, so I decided to make it more jagged so they look more natural. Once I was happy with the form, I started putting in the details of the cliffs. I initially planned to make this cliff to be completely bare with no grass or plants or whatever, but I realized that it might stand out a little too much if I did that, so what I did instead was put patches of bare land and patches of grass here and there. And instead of putting a lot of trees, I only put 3, then proceeded to fill it up with grass, plants, and bushes. The result was this really natural looking landscape. I actually had to do the spotty effect of the landscape twice because I accidentally overwrote the file with TEdit because it was open and I saved it before closing, not realizing it had the previous version. So if you guys are working with TEdit, you should be really careful about when and what you save because it could eat up your time if not done correctly. I also recommend that you save a backup each time you're about to make a major change in your build. And we're finally here at the very last day, the last sprint to the finish line. Because of that cliff that I made on the previous day, I got a little bit unsatisfied with how the other parts of the build look. So I basically went back and refined the other parts. What's really great about working on one part of the build at a time is that once that certain part is done and you're absolutely satisfied with how it looks, you can just copy the materials, colors, and the way you made it into the other parts of the build. So while there were a lot more areas that needed to be refined, it was done a lot quicker. I also decided to add a little bit of bare patches of land all over the map to just kind of break the monotony of grass walls all over the forest. I feel like it was way more interesting that way and also a lot closer to real-life forests. The next part was the grass by the pond. In TEdit, it might look a lot lighter, but it's actually darker in the game. I made it darker because I'm putting into consideration the fact that the area over here is a lot damper than the other areas. I also put a lot more bushes as well. After that, I started working on the group of cliffs on the upper right side of the map. Since I went with the same approach I used on the cliffs on the lower left, it was done without much of a hitch. And there you have it! Viridescent Forest. Thank you so much for watching. Sorry this took a month before I released it. I was stuck working on this build and video for a time because I had a lot of things I wanted to try, but in the end, I just had to tell myself, okay Cheesy, save some of those crazy ideas for later because you'll never finish this. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do leave a like, comment what you think of the build and the video, and subscribe if you want to get updated with my latest videos. And also, if you're interested in downloading this world or even get a wallpaper for this build, please consider checking out my Patreon. It helps me keep the lights on, put food on the table, and encourages me to keep going. Anyways, for now, I'm just gonna go do my thing and you guys do your thing, and I'll see you guys later! Take it easy, stay cheesy.